Before you dive into this epic story of forbidden love and royal secrets, don't forget to support our channel. Hit the subscribe button now, activate the bell for notifications, leave your like and share with those who love a good story. Save the video to watch later if you need. Every interaction helps us bring more exciting narratives like this one. The mist danced between the trees like a restless spirit on that winter night. High on the hill, where the wind carried the scent of damp earth and dormant lavender, Elodie's small cottage stood like a solitary beacon in the darkness. A pale moon struggled to pierce the dense grey veil, bathing the fields in a ghostly light. Elodie tossed and turned in her narrow bed, wrapped in a woolen blanket that had already lost the warmth of the day. It wasn't the cutting whistle of the wind through the cracks that awakened her, but something else, a fragile and persistent sound that tore through the silence of the night like the bleat of a lost lamb. She sat up abruptly, her heart pounding against her ribs. It wasn't her imagination, it was crying. She leapt from the bed, her bare feet meeting the icy stone floor. Wrapping herself in a rustic cape, she took the lamp and lit the wick with trembling fingers. The crying continued, a sharp, desperate moan coming from outside. Holding the light above her head, she crossed the room and struggled to open the door, swollen by moisture. A furious gust of wind invaded the cottage, making the flame violently flicker. The fog was so thick she could barely make out the stone path. That's when she spotted it. On the large round stone marking the entrance, a dark silhouette, a basket. She approached cautiously, the crying now clearer, more distressed. Kneeling, she pulled back the fabric covering the bundle. In the trembling lamplight, a tiny wrinkled face appeared, cheeks flushed from the intense cold. A child, wrapped in deep blue silk blankets, adorned with golden threads that captured the light like rays of imprisoned sunshine. The luxurious texture contrasted violently with the rusticity around. Not something that belonged to anyone from the village. This was a symbol of wealth, nobility, power. Elodie swallowed hard. Her fingers slid through the folds of the blanket until they found a gold medal tied with a red thread to the baby's ankle. She gently raised it to the light. A finely sculpted relief decorated its surface, a fleur-de-lis intertwined with olive branches. She didn't recognize the crest but knew it wasn't common. And then she felt it, something hard under the blanket, beside the baby. Carefully, she slipped her hand in and pulled out a heavy signet ring. Its surface displayed a meticulously engraved shield, a coat of arms unknown to her, but whose authority was palpable even in the darkness. The trembling baby continued to cry. Her decision wasn't rational, it was instinctive. She took him in her arms, pressed him against her chest and carried him inside, closing the door with her shoulder. The heat from the fireplace barely combated the icy air that followed them. She placed the lamp on the table and quickly stoked the embers of the fireplace, murmuring words of comfort her mother had taught her in childhood. As the little one felt human warmth, his cries gradually subsided, reduced to soft moans and slight tremors. His face was round, his pale skin slightly reddened by the cold. A dark lock covered the top of his head, rebellious like a small whirlwind. Elodie prepared a warm infusion with oat milk, drops of valerian and honey. She fed him slowly, observing every movement, every sigh that escaped from the tiny lips. In her heart, something new began to take root, a mixture of tenderness, fear, and responsibility. She placed the baby on a blanket near the fire, wrapping him delicately, and returned to examine the objects. The medal was without doubt a noble insignia, but the ring was something more. She cleaned it with a linen cloth and held the piece up to the light. The shield was intricate, containing a fleur-de-lis, a rising sun, and a stylized crown surrounded by laurels. The image seemed disturbingly familiar. Rising to her feet, she crossed the room to a dusty bookshelf where she kept ancient books inherited from her mother. She took down a thick volume bound in cracked leather and carefully opened it on the table. The pages crackled under her fingers as she leafed through them. In a section dedicated to heraldry, she searched without knowing exactly what she expected to find. And there it was, a sepia illustration showing a ring almost identical to the one she held in her hand. The text explained that it was the seal of the Royal House of France, used exclusively by direct descendants of the monarch. Not a duke or count, but a king. Elodie's pulse quickened until it hurt. She looked at the sleeping baby by the fire, his fists clenched, his breathing deep, oblivious to everything. A thought flashed through her mind like lightning. If someone had left a child with such a symbol, it wasn't by accident. They meant to hide him. And what if someone came looking for him? She closed the book with a sudden movement. No, she wouldn't tell anyone. She couldn't. That night, she tucked the baby in with her best blankets and prepared an improvised bed next to her cot. She didn't sleep. She remained awake, watching over the tiny body, alert. When the baby cried, she comforted him. When he stirred, she sang softly. At some point, fear transformed into certainty. He wasn't her son, but he belonged to her in some way, and she would protect him. At dawn, as the sky began to blush with rosy hues, Elodie rose, took the ring and the medal, and carefully wrapped them in a linen handkerchief. She hid them in a wooden box beneath a loose floorboard. Before storing them away, she examined the ring one last time, holding it between her fingers and allowing the rising light to reveal every line of the crest. There was no doubt. It was the same one she had seen in that ancient heraldry book, an image she never imagined seeing beyond the yellowed pages. The seal of the French royal house. The sun slowly climbed the southern hills, bathing the lavender fields with a golden patina. Although the air still carried traces of nighttime humidity, it promised the beginning of a warm day. What Elodie didn't know was that this decision would mark the beginning of a journey that would transform her life forever. As she watched the baby sleep peacefully, she couldn't imagine that her destiny was intertwined with that of the French royalty in ways that no one could foresee. Continue watching to discover how this abandoned boy and this simple healer will be reunited years later by destiny, when a mysterious stranger arrives in the village seeking answers buried by power, and how a forbidden love will blossom in the shadows of a royal secret that could destroy everything they've built. San Logan awoke with the unhurried rhythm of towns that know nothing of haste. But that morning, a stranger moved through its cobblestone streets, his identity hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat and a grey overcoat. To the townsfolk, he was Luc Morel, but in truth his title, Louis III, King of France, had been left behind along with the echoes of marble hallways, insincere bows, and poisonous whispers of the court. Now only Etienne, his most loyal aide, accompanied him, discreetly watching over the mission from a modest inn at the edge of the forest. Louis wandered among the market stalls like any other visitor. His gaze drifted across baskets overflowing with plums, hand-dyed wool skeins, and bundles of wildflowers. Yet every step he took brought him closer to a truth he had sought for 11 long years. The memory of that night, the night his son disappeared, still throbbed within him like an open wound. The woman who had been with him, a fleeting lady-in-waiting at court, had been sent away before he could intervene. Days later, a rumor smothered by the state council spoke of a concealed pregnancy, of a child born outside acceptable boundaries. Young and still under the sway of his advisors, Louis had learned nothing more than that the woman had died under unclear circumstances and that the child had vanished. It wasn't until recently, when a clue emerged in the private archives of a former palace servant, that hope reignited. A marginal note mentioned a baptism record without a father's name, dated shortly after the scandal. The location, San Logan. And there he was now, standing by a honey stand, pretending to examine glass jars while his eyes scanned the surroundings. That was when he heard it, a clear, firm female voice cutting through the hum of the market. She reprimanded a mischievous-looking boy attempting to slip away with a stolen bundle of lavender. She did not raise her voice or resort to threats. Her calm authority made them unnecessary. Louis turned his head and saw her. She was tall with an upright posture, despite the simplicity of her attire. She wore a white blouse rolled up at the sleeves and an olive-green linen skirt that swayed gently in the breeze. Unbound by a corset, she moved with an unusual freedom for a woman of her time. Her thick, dark braids fell over her shoulders like sun-tamed serpents. She was not conventionally beautiful, but her presence commanded attention, as if nature itself bowed to her will. The scene lasted only seconds. The boy returned the stolen lavender awkwardly and ran off. After adjusting her basket, she walked toward the end of the market. Louis watched her, intrigued, Something about the way she carried herself, the confidence in her movements, and the lingering echo of her voice stirred an unease he couldn't quite define. Later, as the mist settled completely, Luis decided to climb one of the hills near the village. From there, he could see the red-tiled rooftops, fields already blooming, and winding paths threading through olive groves. He sat on a flat stone, letting the wind tousle his hair, and then he saw her again, the woman from the market. She walked along a path between lavender bushes, her skirt gathered in one hand and a basket in the other. Her steps were quick and sure, as if she knew every stone on the path. Behind her, a boy ran with the carefree joy of children, untouched by danger. The boy appeared to be around 11 years old. Barefoot, his shirt half-buttoned, his dark hair tousled from play, he laughed with a pure, crystalline voice. Luis observed him closely, though he couldn't explain why his heart began to race. The boy would pause to pick small flowers from the roadside, then run to catch up with her. At one point, she stopped, crouched down to greet him with a quick embrace, and adjusted his shirt with maternal gestures. Luis felt a sharp pang. The boy was slim, with straight shoulders and precise movements. There was something familiar about the way he walked, too familiar. Then the boy turned on his heels as if sensing he was being watched and looked directly at Luis on the hill. Luis froze. The boy's eyes met his from a distance, clear as morning light, with that same shifting hue between grey and deep blue that Luis saw every day in the mirror. It was impossible not to recognize them. This was no vague resemblance or hopeful illusion. It was an undeniable truth, piercing his chest like an arrow. The boy had his eyes, exactly the same. Descending the hill, Luis couldn't shake the feeling that weighed heavily on his chest. Each step echoed with thoughts colliding in disarray. The boy's age, his bearing, his eyes, all aligned with the shadow of a memory he had tried to bury for 11 years, but that now rose implacably, refusing to remain dormant. Back in the village, he wandered aimlessly, his face hidden beneath his hat, his mind tangled in questions. He stopped at a bakery, buying a piece of rustic bread just to appear ordinary, and sat on a stone bench where he could observe without drawing attention. He began asking discreet questions among the villagers, careful not to arouse suspicion. He mentioned the woman with the long braids, asking if she was a healer, if she accepted visitors, if she was married. The answers surprised him more than he expected. No one knew who the boy's father was. Some said she had found him, others claimed he was hers, though she never spoke of a father. Everyone agreed that one morning she had appeared with the baby in her arms and raised him as her own. "She's always been different," commented an elderly cheese vendor. "They say the earth listens to her, and wounds heal just by her touch." Luis thanked her with a faint smile, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The boy was the right age, his birth fit the timeline, and his face, that face, was unmistakable. Yet doubt lingered. Why would someone leave a child like that in the hands of an unknown woman? Why hadn't there been a trace, a letter, or a ransom? He remembered how, after the lady-in-waiting's disappearance, they had told him the child was dead, that there was no proof of his birth. His advisors had been adamant, even cruel, but now standing there, Luis felt the weight of unanswered questions pressing down on him. The pieces were falling into place, yet the picture they formed was both tantalizing and terrifying. If this boy truly was his son, what did that mean for the woman who had raised him? And what would it mean for the kingdom he had sworn to protect? As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting golden hues over the village, Luis realized that his journey was far from over. The past, once buried, was now rising to meet him, and it demanded answers. The old chapel of San Logan stood as a relic of time, its walls leaning slightly inward as if burdened by the weight of years. The bells had not rung for months, and the altar was adorned with dried, forgotten flowers, a silent testament to neglect. Yet, it was here that Luis found himself, driven by a need for answers buried beneath layers of history and secrets. Father Logan, a thin man with weathered features, greeted him with distant kindness. Luis introduced himself as Luc Morel, a traveler intrigued by local history, particularly ancient records tied to genealogy. The priest, accustomed to curious visitors and idle scholars, allowed him entry without hesitation. Inside the sacristy, the air carried the scent of aged parchment and melted wax. Dust blanketed every surface, including the table where Luis carefully began sifting through yellowed pages. Each book was organized by year, though many entries were faded or smudged by dampness. He searched for one date in particular, a month after that fateful night erased from court memory, the night when he lost the chance to be a father. And then, there it was, a baptismal record. The child's name was Leon, the mother listed as Elod Moreau, with no mention of a paternal surname or noble lineage. Only a brief note accompanied the entry, baptized by mercy, under divine protection, found under extraordinary circumstances. Luis closed his eyes, his heart heavy with the confirmation he hadn't dared hope for. The name meant nothing to him, but the date aligned perfectly. There could be no doubt now. This boy was the son torn from his life before he even had the chance to know him. The realization hit him like a storm, leaving him frozen. He had come seeking a clue, some faint possibility, but now he held proof, and with it, an impossible dilemma. To reveal his identity would risk everything: his crown, the peaceful existence of the woman who had raised his child, and perhaps even the love of the son he had never met. Leaving the sacristy without a word, Luis stepped into the fading sunlight. The sky blazed with hues of orange and pink as people gathered in the central square for the annual celebration of the early lavender harvest. Laughter filled the air, mingling with the aroma of freshly baked bread and red wine. Amidst the festivities, he saw her, Elodie. She stood at a corner stall overseeing a display of ointments and soaps. Her dress, simple yet elegant in lavender, complemented her loosely braided hair cascading over her shoulders. She seemed utterly unaware of the whirlwind of thoughts raging within him. For the first time, Luis saw her, not just as the enigmatic woman who had captivated him, but as a mother, a woman who had nurtured a child not hers by blood, but wholly hers in every other way. From the shadows of a canopy, he watched her, unsure how long he lingered until their eyes finally met. In that moment, the world around them dissolved. Sounds dimmed, lights softened. They existed alone in their shared silence. Elodie frowned slightly, approaching him with steady steps and unwavering composure. When she greeted him, her voice carried a subtle note of caution. Luis responded with equal politeness, acutely aware that each word exchanged might unravel the fragile thread holding his secret together. Their conversation was brief, touching only on mundane topics: the celebration, the weather, the beauty of the countryside. Neither mentioned the child, yet tension simmered between them. Luis noticed every movement she made, the way she avoided meeting his gaze directly, how her arms crossed protectively across her chest. Meanwhile, Elodie observed him too, sensing something out of place. His refined gestures, impeccably educated accent, and commanding posture spoke of a man unaccustomed to obscurity. This was no ordinary traveler hiding out of leisure. It was someone who understood both power and its loss. Then, almost impulsively, she invited him to try one of her tonics. As their fingers brushed during the exchange, an electric spark passed between them. Though fleeting, the touch lingered in Luis's mind long after their hands parted. Elodie studied him closely, while he struggled to hold her gaze, fearing she might see through his carefully constructed facade. It was then, as if fate sought to seal his certainty, that Luis recalled something crucial, an old report buried among court papers. It described a symbol engraved on the ring that had vanished with the child, a symbol identical to the one he himself had worn in his youth. Determined to find the ring, Luis returned to the chapel that night. Father Logan, weary but compliant, granted him permission to review the records again. Luis offered no explanation, merely stating he feared having overlooked something important. Inside the dimly lit sacristy, surrounded by the scent of history and decay, he reopened the ledger, his resolve hardening with each turn of the brittle page. Whatever truths lay hidden here, he vowed to uncover them, for the sake of the boy, for Elodie, and for the future they all deserved. As Luis's gaze swept through the corners of the house, he noticed the dried plants hanging from the ceiling, the stacks of books, and the tools neatly arranged with care. It was a home built with love, effort, and no help from anyone. And then he saw it. A piece of paper hanging from a string, held in place by a wooden clip. It was a child's drawing. Shaky crayon lines, bold colors, undefined shapes. But at its center stood a castle, not just any castle. Towers rose with blue spires, tall windows adorned its facade, and a fountain graced the front. Louis felt his blood freeze. It was the Château de Versailles, the same design, proportions, details. A castle that the boy had never seen. The tea in his hands grew cold, forgotten. How could he possibly know? And then it struck him. This memory wasn't the boy's. It belonged to someone who had once cradled him as an infant, someone whose arms had known him before silence erased everything. The fire still crackled in the hearth when Louis stepped out of Elodie's cottage. The night was thick, carrying the scent of burned lavender and damp wood. He wandered aimlessly along the village paths, his mind consumed by the image of that child's drawing. There was no doubt now. That boy, Leon, carried memories that weren't his own. Impressions etched into his subconscious by an early closeness to a world long silenced. Versailles, the palace where he was born, the place from which he had been torn away. Louis didn't sleep that night. The next morning arrived with a cooler breeze than usual, as if the fields sensed the storm approaching. Barely had the sun begun to illuminate the rooftops of the village when a woman came running through the square, crying out in anguish. Her 7-year-old son had been delirious with fever since dawn. No one knew what to do. Elodie wasted no time. Without a word, she tied her hair back, grabbed her basket filled with jars and herbs, and hurried toward the woman's house. Louis, who had been out buying bread, saw her pass. Something in her expression, a blend of urgency and absolute focus, compelled him to follow without hesitation. Inside, the boy lay drenched in sweat on a makeshift bed, his cheeks flushed, lips cracked. He murmured incoherent words, tossing his head from side to side. His mother wept silently by the door. Elodie placed a cool cloth on the child's forehead, checked his abdomen, wrists, observed his red eyes and labored breathing. Then she turned to Louis as though she'd known he was there all along. "I need wild Melissa, valerian root, and mullein flowers," she said firmly. "They grow on the west hill near the stream. There's no time to waste." He nodded without hesitation, took the basket she handed him and set off. The path uphill was steep, bushes tangling at the edges as if trying to slow intruders. Louis moved with determined steps, guided by Elodie's precise instructions. As he climbed, memories of his childhood in the palace gardens surfaced, where everything grew under strict control, where no plant sprouted without permission. This hill, however, was a beautiful chaos. Vegetation thrived wildly, governed only by sun and water. In the clearing where the stream forked, he found the mullein flowers, tall and yellow, peeking between stones. Carefully cutting what he needed, he continued higher. Near a moss-covered rock, he discovered the melissa, its jagged leaves releasing a lemony aroma. The capricious valerian grew close to the shade. He extracted it carefully, ensuring the roots remained intact. On his way down, he crossed paths with Elodie, who had come looking for him after realizing he was taking longer than expected. She was barefoot, her dress hiked up to her knees, determination blazing in her eyes. "I thought you'd gotten lost," she said, her tone free of reproach. Louis smiled, breathless from the climb. "I thought you already knew me better than that." No more words were exchanged as they walked back together along the vineyard paths, now tinged with green. Few words passed between them, yet their silences brimmed with something deeper. Understanding, respect, a tension that vibrated with every brush of their steps. Louise dared to glance at her sideways. Her brow glistened with sweat, her hair disheveled, and still she looked more radiant than any silk-clad lady. Elodie didn't look at him, but she knew he watched her, and she didn't stop him. When they reached the sick child's home, Elodie prepared a decoction with the freshly gathered herbs, pounding them with a mortar and boiling them in clean water. With a soaked cloth, she rubbed the boy's ears back and gently administered the infusion drop by drop until he began to calm. His heavy eyelids closed slowly, the fever subsiding. Louise lingered at the doorway, watching Elodie's movements with a mix of admiration and unease. In her hands lay a power unlike any taught in the halls of the Louvre, the ability to heal, console, and mend without armies or treaties. As they left the house, the sun dipped behind clouds. Louise offered to escort her back to her cottage, but she declined with a kind smile. "No wolves here," she said lightly. "Just gossip, and those don't bite, though sometimes they tear." Elodie disappeared among the trails, leaving behind the scent of herbs and something else, a lingering premonition. From the shadow of a fig tree, the nobleman Armand observed her departure. That same night, dressed in his darkest coat, he arrived at Elodie's cottage bearing a bottle of aged wine and a strained smile. They spoke briefly at the entrance until he pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. Inside was a discreet jewel, an antique cameo with a miniature portrait. He presented it as a symbol of a bond he wished to formalize, clarifying it wasn't a mere flirtation, but an act of protection. "Your son deserves stability," he said earnestly, "and you deserve someone to support you." Elodie regarded him silently for a long moment. Then, with the grace only she could muster without losing firmness, she declined. She did so without wounding him, but left no room for hope either. Hope was not something Armand offered easily. He tucked the small velvet box back into his coat, bowed stiffly, and turned to leave. Yet, as he walked away, his expression betrayed more than mere disappointment. It carried suspicion. Back at his estate, Armand sat down at his desk, quill in hand, and began to write a letter. It wasn't just any letter. It was addressed to a trusted contact in Paris. The words flowed deliberately, describing a traveler named Luc Morel, a man who spoke with the precision of an academic, moved with the discipline of a soldier, and carried himself with manners no villager could have ever learned. At the end of the letter, Armand posed a single pointed question. Was there anyone in the court by that name? Or perhaps someone who had vanished recently without explanation? 4 days later, the reply arrived. Written in blue ink and signed with careful initials, the response confirmed what Armand had begun to suspect. King Louis had left the palace over a week ago, unaccompanied by his usual entourage, and his whereabouts were unknown. As Armand read the words, his grip on the paper tightened until it crumpled slightly at the edges. His eyes gleamed with something beyond curiosity, ambition. He had stumbled upon something significant and he intended to use it. That night, Louis did not sleep. He paced the length of his modest room, the creaking floorboards beneath his boots, doing little to quiet the storm raging in his mind. The air inside was heavy, thick with the scent of melted wax and aged wood. Outside, the wind battered the shutters with an irregular rhythm, as if nature itself sensed the turmoil within him. Something inside Louis had shifted. The accidental brush of Elodie's hands, the way she had held his gaze just a moment longer than necessary. It lingered in his thoughts. Even the shared silence as they descended through the vineyards had left an indelible mark. And yet, he forced himself to remember who he was. He couldn't afford to forget, not for a moment, the weight of the crown he had left behind, even if only temporarily. The kingdom awaited him, with its ministers, its obligations, its alliances woven with painstaking care. If the truth came to light, if he confessed his identity, if he publicly acknowledged the boy as his heir, the scandal would be unavoidable. The crown might waver, and Elodie, Léon, and the life they had built together would be thrust into a maelstrom that had never been theirs to endure. Could he truly protect them? Could he offer them a life free from fear? Seated at the small desk in his room, Louis lit a fresh candle and opened the notebook where he had jotted down some of his recent thoughts. But this time he didn't write. Instead, he stared at the flickering flame, letting the silence speak for him. The truth was simple, though painful. He wanted to stay. He longed to belong, to become part of that humble home, to share in the laughter that filled the air each evening, to walk among the wild lavender fields, to sit by the fire exchanging quiet murmurs with her. But duty called louder than his heart. The next day, Louis kept his distance. He declined the blacksmith's invitation to help with the repair, avoided passing through the central square, and stayed away from the village children's celebration. Even when he saw Léon playing with other boys, chasing after an improvised kite, he hid behind a hedge, unwilling to reveal himself. It was a cowardly act, and he knew it, but he couldn't bring himself to face them. Elodie noticed his absence, of course. How could she not? In the days that followed, she woke each morning with a heaviness in her chest she couldn't quite explain. She told herself it was the change of season, the dampness heralding the coming rains, but deep down she knew better. Luke, this enigmatic, reserved man who felt both foreign and familiar, no longer appeared at her door or crossed her path along the trails. Though she wouldn't admit it even to herself, she missed him. Part of her felt foolish for expecting anything more. What had she hoped for? A fleeting summer romance? A declaration? A future? The truth was, she didn't know what she wanted, only that she felt incomplete without him. Genevieve, ever perceptive, watched her closely. She didn't say much, but her words carried weight when they came. During their herb gathering sessions or while packaging soaps, she would drop phrases laden with double meaning. "A man's silence sometimes speaks louder than his words," she remarked once. Or, "Those who leave without explanations often carry burdens that burn." To make matters worse, Madame Rousseau and her followers grew increasingly inquisitive. They whispered behind their hands after Mass, casting veiled comments about unwed women and men with mysterious pasts. The social pressure, which Elodie had always defied with courage, now weighed heavier than ever. And then there was Armand. Since his rejected proposal, he had maintained an outward appearance of dignity. He continued to greet her politely, asked indirect questions about her well-being, and occasionally sent gifts for the boy, a book, a knitted scarf, a box of sweets. But his eyes had changed. There was an intensity in them now, a determination hidden beneath layers of civility. Louis had noticed it too. From the hill where he sometimes sought refuge to think, he had seen Armand several times, lurking near Elodie's cottage without entering, watching like a patient wolf. That night, unable to bear the distance any longer, Louis climbed once more to the promontory overlooking Elodie's house. The sky was overcast, the stars obscured by a grey veil. The fields lay still, cloaked in darkness, but Louis's heart found no rest. Below him, the faint glow of a lantern illuminated the windows of the cottage. He imagined Léon asleep in his bed, wrapped in blankets, and Elodie sitting by the fire, perhaps writing in her notebook or polishing one of her jars. He longed to be there, to cross the field and knock on her door, to tell her the truth, to beg her forgiveness for keeping so much hidden, but something held him back. From the path leading out of the woods, a figure emerged. It was Armand, clad in a long coat carrying a wooden box. He walked slowly, deliberately, stopping in front of the cottage door. With a soft knock, he waited. Louis held his breath, straining to hear. Elodie opened the door and Armand held up the box, speaking with apparent seriousness. She listened in silence, her body tense, her head tilted slightly. Then she stepped aside, allowing him to enter. Louis clenched his fists, anger and frustration boiling within him. He hadn't planned to intervene, but seeing Armand step inside with that box felt like a violation he couldn't ignore. Without thinking, he descended the hill, his cape billowing behind him like a dark omen. By the time he reached the cottage, Armand was already inside. The scene felt frozen, as if painted in oil. Elodie stood with a furrowed brow, her lips parted as if interrupted mid-thought. Armand stood tall, confident, his fingers poised on the clasp of the box. Louis knocked lightly on the open door, his voice steady but firm. "Excuse me," he said, feigning breathlessness. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I heard there was an urgent matter nearby. I thought Elodie might need assistance." The tension in the room was palpable. Armand turned slowly, his eyes locking onto Louis's. "How convenient," he said, his tone smooth but edged with mockery. "Your timing is impeccable, Monsieur Morel." Louis inclined his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken implications. Finally, Armand turned back to Elodie. "I apologize for the intrusion," he said, his voice dripping with insincerity. "Perhaps another time would be more appropriate." With a curt bow, he exited, brushing past Louis without another word. Their eyes met briefly, and in that glance, Louis saw a warning, a promise that Armand would not let this go. When the door closed behind him, the sound echoed like a drumbeat in both their chests. Elodie remained standing, rigid, unsure whether to thank Louis or reproach him for his sudden arrival. Louis, for his part, hesitated, torn between speaking and leaving. "I'm sorry for barging in like that," he began, his voice low. Elodie cut him off with a gesture of her hand. She walked to the table and lit another candle, as if the additional light might help her make sense of what had just transpired. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows on the stone walls, making the room feel even more intimate, more vulnerable. "He came to propose marriage," she said finally, her tone neutral, almost detached, as if discussing the weather. "He offered a family heirloom." She paused, her back still turned to him. "I didn't expect it tonight." Luis nodded, unsure of what to say. His silence spoke volumes. "I don't love him," Elodie added, her voice softer now. "And I don't want Leon to grow up feeling like he was part of some transaction meant to benefit someone else." Luis took a step closer, the wavering light catching his face in half shadow. "You don't deserve that," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Elodie turned to face him then, her eyes meeting his. In that moment, everything unspoken between them crystallized. The suppressed longing, the tenderness that had grown unnoticed, the fear of crossing a threshold from which there was no return, all of it hung in the air, tangible and electric. Luis raised a hand hesitantly, then gently brushed his fingertips against her cheek. It was a fleeting touch, but it ignited something neither of them could suppress. Their faces drew closer, drawn together by an irresistible force. Seconds stretched into eternity as their lips hovered just inches apart. Then, a sound shattered the spell. "Mama!" The voice was soft, barely a murmur, but it was enough to pull them apart like sleepers startled awake. Leon stood in the doorway, his eyes wide, disoriented. His breathing was ragged. "I had a nightmare," he said, walking toward his mother. Elodie knelt to embrace him, burying her face in his hair. Luis took a step back, his hands trembling, his chest pounding with a mixture of desire and frustration. "Do you want me to stay with you tonight?" Elodie asked the boy. Leon nodded, still shaken. Luis understood. It wasn't his place to be there anymore. He muttered an apology and turned toward the door. Before stepping out, he looked back at her one last time. She didn't stop him, but her eyes pleaded for something even she couldn't fully comprehend. That night, Luis didn't return to his room. He wandered through the forest for hours, aimless, unsheltered, as if the cold could extinguish the fire burning within him. By dawn, when he finally made his way back to the mill, his clothes were soaked with dew, and his soul felt more wounded than ever. From the hill, he could see the soft glow of light filtering through the windows. He imagined Leon already asleep, wrapped in blankets, and Elodie by the fire, perhaps writing in her notebook or polishing one of her jars. He longed to be there, to cross that field, knock on her door and finally tell her the truth, to ask for forgiveness for keeping so much hidden. But something stopped him. From the path leading out of the woods, a figure emerged. It was Armand, clad in a long coat, carrying a wooden box the size of a thick book. He walked with slow, deliberate steps, stopping in front of the door. He knocked softly. Luis held his breath. Though he couldn't hear the words, he could see their movements clearly. Elodie opened the door, and Armand lifted the box, speaking with apparent seriousness. She listened in silence, her body tense, her head slightly bowed. Then she stepped back just enough to let him inside. Luis didn't think. He didn't calculate. The moment he saw Armand cross the threshold with that box in hand, a fierce, unfamiliar surge coursed through his chest. He descended the hill almost at a run, the wind whipping against his face, his cape billowing behind him like an omen. He arrived breathless at the cabin's entrance, just as Armand, now inside, was about to open the box. The scene felt frozen, like a painting. Elodie stood with a faint frown, her lips parted as if interrupted mid-thought. Armand stood tall and confident, his fingers poised on the clasp of the case. Luis knocked lightly on the open door, his palm striking it as if it were an invisible barrier that might still prevent the inevitable. "Excuse me," he said, feigning breathlessness. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I heard there was an urgent matter nearby. I thought Elodie might need assistance." Elodie didn't speak immediately. She looked from one man to the other, her expression unreadable, as if her world had been thrown off balance without warning. Armand closed the box with a dry click, unhurried, his gesture practiced, never breaking eye contact with Luis. "How convenient," he remarked, his tone neutral but edged with mockery. "Your timing is impeccable, Monsieur Morel." Luis inclined his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken implications. Finally, Armand turned back to Elodie. "I apologize for the intrusion," he said smoothly. "I thought tonight would be appropriate, but I see that it isn't." "Good evening, madame." He bowed slightly before leaving, his eyes meeting Luis's as he passed. A spark of warning gleamed in them, though no further words were needed. When the door closed behind him, the sound echoed like a drumbeat in both their chests. Elodie remained standing, rigid, unsure whether to thank Luis or reproach him for his sudden arrival. Luis, for his part, hesitated, torn between speaking and leaving. "I'm sorry for barging in like this," he began, his voice low. Elodie cut him off with a gesture of her hand. She walked to the table and lit another candle, as if the additional light might help her make sense of what had just transpired. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows on the stone walls, making the room feel even more intimate, more vulnerable. "He came to propose marriage," she said finally, her tone neutral, almost detached, as if discussing the weather. "He offered a family heirloom." She paused, her back still turned to him. "I didn't expect it tonight." Luis nodded, unsure of what to say. His silence spoke volumes. "I don't love him," Elodie added, her voice softer now. "And I don't want Leon to grow up feeling like he was part of some transaction meant to benefit someone else." Luis took a step closer, the wavering light catching his face in half shadow. "You don't deserve that," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Elodie turned to face him then, her eyes meeting his. In that moment, everything unspoken between them crystallized. The suppressed longing, the tenderness that had grown unnoticed, the fear of crossing a threshold from which there was no return. All of it hung in the air, tangible and electric. Luis raised a hand hesitantly, then gently brushed his fingertips against her cheek. It was a fleeting touch, but it ignited something neither of them could suppress. Their faces drew closer, drawn together by an irresistible force. Seconds stretched into eternity as their lips hovered just inches apart. Then a sound shattered the spell. "Mama!" The voice was soft, barely a murmur, but it was enough to pull them apart like sleepers startled awake. Leon stood in the doorway, his eyes wide, disoriented. His breathing was ragged. "I had a nightmare," he said, walking toward his mother. Elodie knelt to embrace him, burying her face in his hair. Luis took a step back, his hands trembling, his chest pounding with a mixture of desire and frustration. "Do you want me to stay with you tonight?" Elodie asked the boy. Leon nodded, still shaken. Luis understood. It wasn't his place to be there anymore. He muttered an apology and turned toward the door. Before stepping out, he looked back at her one last time. She didn't stop him, but her eyes pleaded for something even she couldn't fully comprehend. That night, Luis didn't return to his room. He wandered through the forest for hours, aimless, unsheltered, as if the cold could extinguish the fire burning within him. By dawn, when he finally made his way back to the mill, his clothes were soaked with dew, and his soul felt more wounded than ever. The next morning, as Elodie opened her door to fetch water from the well, she found a carefully placed note on the step. The paper was thick, unsealed, the ink firm and black. There was no signature, no sender, just a single line written in precise handwriting. "The man you let into your home is not who he claims to be." The paper crumpled slightly between Elodie's fingers as her eyes traced the sentence again and again. It bore no name, no date, no clue to its origin, only the searing certainty that whoever had written it knew far more than they revealed. That brevity, that venomous accusation, struck with precision where it hurt most. Her trust. For long minutes, she stood motionless in front of the door, the morning light barely outlining her figure. The cool breeze stirred the hem of her dress, but she didn't move. Her entire being was focused on that single line etched into her mind. Luke wasn't Luke, or at least not entirely, and though her stubborn heart refused to accept it, her intuition whispered that truths lay hidden behind those grey eyes that had captivated her so deeply. Luke was not Luke, or at least not entirely. Though her stubborn heart refused to accept it, Elodie's intuition whispered that there were truths hidden behind those grey eyes that had captivated her so deeply. She tucked the note into a drawer beneath an embroidered cloth that had belonged to her mother and returned inside. Leon slept soundly, blissfully unaware of the whirlwind of emotions swirling around her. Elodie gazed at him with a mixture of tenderness and fear. She had risked his safety by allowing a stranger, however kind, however proper, to cross the threshold of their home, their lives, without truly knowing who he was. That afternoon, under the pretext of making a donation to the church, she walked toward the village parish. The bell tower stood solitary among the rooftops, and the breeze carried the scent of stale incense and melted wax. Father Logan greeted her with a polite smile, though his small dark eyes observed her with more interest than usual. "Father," she began after exchanging pleasantries, "there's something troubling me. I've had doubts about one of our visitors, a man who calls himself Luc Morel." The priest tilted his head, feigning surprise. "The traveler? The one who helps with the shelter work?" She nodded. Father Laurent stroked his beard slowly. "Curious that you mention him. Just yesterday I received a letter from Paris. The sender asked for discretion, but given your concerns, I feel I must tell you that this name has appeared in certain delicate reports." Elodie felt a chill run down her spine. "What kind of reports?" The priest didn't answer immediately. He rose, walked to a desk and pretended to search through papers, as if needing time to weigh his words. "It seems the name Luc Morel has been used by individuals involved in questionable activities. One of them is allegedly connected to the court. Whether as a spy, an imposter, or something worse, I cannot say. It's not my place to judge, but I must admit, the mystery surrounding this man is quite unusual." Elodie bid him farewell shortly after, her courtesy strained. As she left the church, her body trembled. She walked slowly, her soul split in two. One part of her wanted to run home, embrace Leon, and shut the door on the world. The other part sought out Luc, or whoever he truly was, to demand answers, to find out if everything they had shared was a lie woven with expert hands. Meanwhile, Luis wandered along the edge of the stream, mentally reviewing every word he had spoken and omitted in recent days. His silence had become a wall, one he now didn't know how to tear down. He had believed that distancing himself was the wisest choice, but all he had done was fracture the fragile trust that had only just begun to bloom between them. That same evening, he decided to approach her. He knocked on Elodie's door with hesitant steps. When she opened it, he knew instantly that something had changed. Her gaze was no longer warm. It was cautious, impenetrable. "Can we talk?" he asked. She let him in without a word. The atmosphere inside the cabin was heavy. Luis remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back while Elodie sat facing him, her fingers intertwined in her lap. "Who are you?" she asked directly. Luis swallowed hard. It wasn't the time to reveal everything, not yet, but neither could he continue lying. "I'm someone who has made mistakes," he said softly, "but also someone who has felt something real for you, for your son." Elodie stared at him without blinking. "That doesn't answer my question," she replied. Luis lowered his gaze, knowing he was losing her. "I'm not who you think I am, but I'm not an imposter either. My past is complicated. I didn't come here to hurt you. I came seeking answers, though I never imagined I'd find them here." Her lips tightened. She wanted to scream at him, to hug him, to beg him not to destroy what had barely begun to blossom, but she couldn't. "I'd appreciate it if you didn't return until you were ready to tell me the truth," she said firmly. Luis nodded slowly, as if each movement pained him. He left without looking back. That night, rumors in the village gained momentum. Armand, with his smooth voice and serpent-like smile, began speaking in the tavern, not directly, of course, but through insinuations, questions cast into the air like bait. Who was this stranger, really? Where had he come from? Why was he so interested in a woman alone with a child who bore no surname? Madame Rousseau, ever vigilant to the winds of scandal, organized a meeting with the town's most influential women under the pretense of discussing the upcoming mass. They debated the moral danger posed by the presence of an unknown man alongside such a vulnerable woman. Elodie was not invited. That night, as the wind whistled through the cracks of the cabin and Leon slept deeply, Elodie sat by the fire, a trembling cup of herbal infusion in her hands. She had stopped crying. There were no more tears, only a sharp, anticipatory sense of loss. Something compelled her to rise, a premonition, almost physical in its intensity. She took Leon's coat, which hung by the door, to check if it was dry. As she slipped her hand into one of the pockets, her fingers brushed against something metallic, cold and heavy. Slowly, she pulled it out. It was a ring, and not just any ring. It was the same one she had hidden away 11 years ago, the one she had found beside the baby on that foggy night, the one bearing the royal seal of France, the one she had concealed beneath the floorboard, convinced it should never see the light of day. Her heart stopped. The weight of the ring in her hand was unbearable, as if it carried within it the weight of 11 years of silence and secrets. She stared at the engraved shield, the golden crown, the fleur-de-lis entwined with olive branches. Every detail was achingly familiar. Her mind raced, piecing together fragments of memories, fears, and suspicions. How had it ended up in Leon's pocket? And what did it mean for the man who called himself Luc Morel? The ring trembled between Elodie's fingers, as if it carried a life of its own, as if 11 years of silence and secrets still pulsed within its cold metal. She held it with both hands, her eyes fixed on the intricately engraved shield, a golden crown, the fleur-de-lis intertwined with olive branches, and that faint Latin inscription she barely noticed but remembered, as if she had read it just yesterday. It couldn't be a coincidence. Her chest tightened, her pulse raced. She moved toward the room where her son slept. The door was slightly ajar, and from the shadows, the boy's figure seemed wrapped in an aura of untouchable innocence. His face was peaceful in sleep, though traces of the tears from the night before lingered. Elodie knelt beside his bed, the ring clenched in her palm. She gently stroked his hair before whispering his name. "Leon, sweetheart, wake up." The boy stirred, rubbing his eyes, and when he saw her so close, he smiled groggily. "What is it, Mama?" She took a deep breath, steadying her voice to sound calm but firm. "I need you to tell me something, and I want you to be completely honest with me." She showed him the ring. Leon blinked, confused. "It was in Mr. Luc's coat. He let me play with it when he came to check on Etienne. I went into his room while he wasn't there and tried it on for a bit, but then I put it back in my coat to show you. I forgot to give it to you." Elodie swallowed hard. "Do you know what this ring means?" Leon shook his head. "Only that it's pretty. It has a strange design, like a castle." She nodded, breathing deeply, and hugged him tightly. There was no malice in his gesture, just the innocent curiosity of a child. But for her, the revelation was a verdict. Luc was the man she had let into her home, into her life. Not only had he not been truthful, but he had also carried with him all this time tangible proof of the boy's origins. He had come to take him away, to rip him from the only life he had ever known. She wouldn't allow it. The next morning, Elodie packed calmly. Clothes for several days, jars of herbs and dried roots, and a few kitchen utensils. She prepared everything with the efficiency of someone who had lived with fear as a constant companion for years. She left no notes, no warnings. She simply told Leon they were going to Aunt Genevieve's house to help with the yarrow harvest. Delighted by the change of scenery, the boy didn't ask questions. They crossed the path leading out of the village just as the first rays of sunlight painted the distant peaks pink. Genevieve greeted them without words, opening her arms wide. She let them in and served them hot tea with honey. She understood more than she said. She knew that silence was, at that moment, the only protection Elodie needed. A new routine settled in with the calmness of long days. Leon helped in the garden, cared for the neighbors' cats, and wrote in a notebook about what he observed in the fields. Elodie, on the other hand, worked with the herbs with precision, as if cutting leaves and drying petals could also peel away the confusion in her soul. But the peace was only superficial. At night, when the boy slept and Genevieve offered her a glass of elderflower liqueur, Elodie allowed herself to think. What if she had misunderstood everything? What if Luc, or Louis, as she now suspected, with a chilling dread, had reasons far more complex for his silence? And what if, in her effort to protect her son, she was pushing away the only man she had ever loved? Meanwhile, in the village, Louis noticed the absence immediately. It was a Sunday, and the rooster's crow did not bring him the same sense of calm. He went out early, but Elodie's cabin was closed, the door showing no recent signs of footsteps. The flowers on the threshold were wilted from lack of water. He went to Genevieve's house, but no one answered. Among the neighbors, he found only evasive phrases, short responses, uncomfortable gestures. In the tavern, an old man told him that perhaps the healer had left for good. At the bakery, the owner gave him a look that warned him not to ask further questions. Even the priest, who had once greeted him with distant formality, now looked at him as if he were an intruder and denied him access to the records. "I'm sorry, Mr. Morel. These matters are no longer available for public consultation." Luis left with a heavy heart. Every corner of the village seemed to be closing its doors to him. Rumors swirled around him like poisonous fog. He knew Armand had something to do with it, and he also knew time was running out. Back at the inn, Etienne, his loyal assistant, was waiting for him in the back stable. "Your Majesty," he said softly, "we have a problem. Letters are circulating in Paris. Some ministers are growing restless. Your disappearance can no longer be kept secret for much longer." Luis ran his hands over his face. The weight of the truth could no longer be postponed. "Bring me the cipher tonight. I'll write to the palace. I'll demand all the information about what happened that night, the night my son disappeared." Hours later, in the darkness of his room, with only a single candle lit and the windows shut tight to avoid prying eyes, Luis wrote the message by hand. He used the codes he had learned in his youth, ones only a few could decipher. He requested details about the wet nurse, the woman who had given birth, and the silenced records. He sent it with a mounted messenger before dawn. 2 days later, he received the response, a simple, unadorned envelope. He opened it with trembling hands, knowing it would change everything. The message read the child might still be alive. They abandoned him in the south. The paper quivered in his grasp, and though the message contained only a single line, its meaning hit him like an earthquake. The child might still be alive. They abandoned him in the south. Luis stood frozen in the center of the room, the paper still damp from the journey's condensation. The silence was so thick that even the faint creak of the wooden floor beneath his feet sounded deafening. For a moment, his mind went blank, as if it needed space to process this truth. Then the image of Léon's face assaulted him with devastating clarity. Those gray eyes, that curious gaze, the way he smiled. He couldn't waste any more time. For a moment, his mind went blank, as if it needed space to process the enormity of the truth. Then, like a flash, the image of Léon's face invaded his thoughts. Those gray eyes, that curious gaze, the way he smiled with innocent mischief. It hit him with devastating clarity. He couldn't waste another second. As night fell, Luis set out in secret toward Albi, a larger city to the north of the region. There, in quiet seclusion, lived one of his former council members, Count Adrien de Marsac. Years ago, Adrien had been stripped of his position after defying orders to silence the scandal surrounding the missing child. Luis remembered him as a man of integrity, someone who never quite fit into the murky waters of court politics. The journey was long and silent. He borrowed a horse from the inn stable and rode for hours along dusty, deserted roads. His hood pulled low over his face, his heart pounding like a drum that refused to quiet. By the time he reached the outskirts of Albi at dawn, the sky was just beginning to blush with shades of lavender. The Count's house was modest compared to the grandeur of his former rank, a humble country estate, surrounded by wild vineyards and walnut trees, with uneven tiles and an iron gate covered in moss. Luis dismounted and knocked firmly on the door. There was no immediate answer. He waited, then knocked again. Finally, an elderly servant opened the door, eyeing him with suspicion. But when he heard Luis's name and saw his face, the face that didn't appear in official portraits, but was etched into the memory of every crown loyalist, he stepped aside without a word. Adrien received him in a wood-paneled room, a half-finished glass of brandy in one hand and a blanket draped over his legs. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice tinged with disbelief and weariness. "I never imagined I'd see you again." Luis didn't waste time on pleasantries. "I need to know everything they didn't tell me, everything hidden about the child." Adrien studied him for a long moment, as if weighing whether the truth still held any meaning after so much time. "I thought you had given up looking for him," he said finally. I thought it no longer mattered to you. It always mattered, Luis replied, his voice rough with emotion. But I never knew the full truth. They lied to me. They made me believe the child was dead. Adrien set the glass down and sighed deeply. His aged face seemed more human under the soft light streaming through the window. It was one night, just one. You and that young woman, what was her name? No one knows. She wasn't of the court, just a lady sent from the provinces, insignificant in the eyes of power. She never returned. The Queen Mother demanded the entire matter be silenced. There were fears of scandal, of an illegitimate claim to the throne. They said the child would be a threat to the lineage, a political danger. Luis nodded. He already knew this part, but not the rest. What happened afterward? Adrien's eyes softened with sorrow. She died days after giving birth, complications from childbirth. The child was handed over to a wet nurse in the south, a woman instructed to raise him far from the capital, without records, without witnesses. But there was a problem during the transfer. The men transporting him veered off course. There was a storm. The carriage was found abandoned days later. The occupants were gone. Where? Luis asked, though he already feared the answer. On the outskirts of St. Logan. Luis closed his eyes as the pieces clicked into place with terrifying precision. Adrien leaned closer. I tried to follow the trail, but I was expelled before I could uncover more. Since then, I've lived with the guilt of not having pushed harder. Luis thanked him with a nod and took his leave. As he stepped out of the estate, the air felt different, thicker, heavier, as if the entire countryside shared his breath. There were no more doubts, no lingering shadows. Leon was his son, and Elodie. Elodie had been his guardian, his protector, his mother in every sense that truly mattered. He returned to St. Logan that same afternoon, his body weary but his heart ablaze. He didn't stop at the inn or speak to anyone. Instead, he headed straight for Genevieve's house, certain he would find them there. He had resolved to tell her everything, to lay bare the truth. There was no room left for silence, but when he arrived, something felt wrong. The wooden gate, which was usually closed by nightfall, hung ajar. Inside, the silence was thick, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Luis dismounted quickly and crossed the threshold. Elodie, he called, his voice firm. There was no response. He moved cautiously, his boots echoing against the stone floor. The living room was empty, the breakfast cup still on the table, the fire extinguished. Her scarf hung from a chair, swaying slightly in the draught. He climbed the wooden stairs carefully, checking each room. The house was empty. Luis stepped back outside, his heart pounding like a war drum. The cold evening breeze bit at his face, but he barely noticed. His mind was consumed by absence. The signs of a recent departure, the still warm teacup, the scarf fluttering in the doorway, the half-open gate, as if someone had fled in haste, unwilling to look back. He mounted his horse and descended to the village. The streets were quiet but not deserted. Villagers swept their doorsteps, hung laundry and watered herbs in silence. But as soon as they saw Luis, they averted their eyes or disappeared behind shutters. He was no longer the friendly stranger who helped at the fair or the reserved man who wandered among the lavender fields. Now he was an outsider whose presence carried too much weight. He sought out the only person who might offer him honest answers, the elderly healer who sold sachets of dried rosemary at the corner of the market. Without preamble, he asked, "Where is Elodie?" The old woman looked at him silently for a moment, then sighed. "She left this morning walking with the boy." "To where?" "To the village in the hills, beyond the gorge of the oak. She used to live with her mentor, the old Lena. They say it's a secluded place, shrouded in mist almost all year round. If someone wanted to disappear, that would be the place." Luis nodded briefly without stopping to explain further. He mounted his horse again, adjusted his cloak and set off toward the north without wasting a moment. The path ahead was arduous. The trees seemed to close in around him like gnarled arms, their branches intertwining as if trying to block his way. The rocks, slick from recent rain, made the horse's hooves slip with every step. Each twist and turn of the mountain felt like a test, as though it were forcing him to question whether he truly deserved to reach her. But with every challenge, his resolve only grew stronger. He would not give up. As he climbed higher, his mind wandered back to the young king he had once been. the same man who had sat in cold marble halls, surrounded by advisors whose words slithered like snakes. He remembered the countless toasts raised for a kingdom crumbling at its edges, and how he had convinced himself that duty was everything, that personal sacrifice was the ultimate badge of honor. But now, his thoughts turned to her. The way she spoke each word as if choosing it carefully, her hands stained with earth yet brimming with wisdom, the child who laughed as though he had never known fear. She had built a life outside the confines of power, a life filled with courage and authenticity. For the first time in years, Luis understood that the throne meant nothing if he could not share it with those who gave meaning to his existence. Not with diplomats or courtiers or alliances, but with the woman who had saved his son, with the boy who carried his blood, his legacy, and his future. With the family fate had returned to him. The rain began to fall softly as he spotted the stone cottage nestled among the trees, smoke curling gently from the chimney, a small garden flourishing in front. He tied his horse to a post and approached on foot, his heart pounding unevenly against his chest. He knocked on the door twice, his knuckles rapping lightly against the wood. Elodie opened it, her face illuminated by the trembling light of the fire within. Her expression was a complex mix of surprise, anger, and something deeper, more inscrutable. She didn't move immediately. Instead, she simply stared at him, as if unsure whether to embrace him or slam the door in his face. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice low and controlled. Luis hesitated for a moment before stepping inside and closing the door behind him. He looked into her eyes, knowing he could no longer remain silent. "I couldn't stay quiet any longer," he said firmly. She crossed her arms over her chest. "Are you here to give me another incomplete version of the truth? Another half-truth?" He shook his head. "I'm here to tell you everything." And so he did, his voice steady and calm as he revealed not just his true identity, Louis, King of France, but also the story they had kept hidden from him. He spoke of that night in the palace, of the woman who had vanished, of the child he had been told was dead. He told her about the silent conspiracy that had separated him from his own flesh and blood, about the lost ring, the hidden reports, and the former advisor who had been dismissed for daring to seek the truth. "I didn't know," he said, his voice breaking. "I swear I didn't. If I had known I had a son, if I had even imagined..." Elodie didn't move. She simply watched him, her dark, deep eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You're not here to claim him," she interrupted, her voice firm. "You're not here to take him away to a palace or rip him from my arms." "No," Louis replied earnestly. "I came because I understand now that you were the one who protected him when everyone else failed. You cared for him, saved him, raised him with love. I came because without you, without them, I am nothing." A heavy silence settled between them. Elodie looked at him as if seeing him for the first time, as both the man she had secretly loved and someone entirely different. Just then, a small voice broke the tension. "Does this mean I'm a prince?" They both turned to see Leon standing in the doorway, his hair tousled from sleep, a blanket trailing behind him. His wide, round eyes darted between them, a mixture of wonder and fear in his gaze. Louis knelt down, leveling his eyes with the boys. The cabin was silent, except for the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Outside, the wind shook the tree branches, as if nature itself held its breath. Leon's question hung in the air. "Does this mean I'm a prince?" Louis nodded slowly, his eyes shining with an emotion too profound for words. "Yes, my son. That means you are a prince. My son." Elodie turned her face slightly, struggling to maintain her composure, to hold on to the walls that had protected her for so long. But seeing Leon's mixture of confusion and awe melted her defenses. She stepped forward, wrapping an arm around him and pulling him close. "Nothing will change what you are," she whispered. "You will always be my boy." Louis watched as she enveloped the child in tenderness, and a steadfast certainty grew in his heart. It didn't matter what the throne demanded, what titles awaited, or what ministers might expect. He had found what he had not even realized he'd been searching for all these years, and he wasn't going to let it go. The next morning, the three descended the mountain together. Their journey back to St. Logan was slow, wrapped in the mist of dawn and the murmurs of hidden streams weaving through the trees. Leon slept atop the horse, wrapped in a blanket Elodie had woven with her own hands. She and Louis walked in silence, sometimes holding hands, sometimes letting the quiet speak for them. The village greeted them with a mix of astonishment and anticipation. It took only a glimpse of them together at the foot of the hill for rumors to spread like wildfire. Within an hour, Armand was already waiting in the square, accompanied by Madame Rousseau and a group of hastily summoned villagers. "You cannot simply return like this," Armand snapped as soon as he saw them. "The village demands answers. The scandal can no longer be concealed. It is being said that this man has lived among us under a false identity and now appears with the son of an unwed woman." "Careful, sir," Louis responded, his voice calm but firm. "You have not yet heard what I have to say." Elodie tightened her grip on her son's hand as the square filled with curious faces, peering out from behind windows and doors, gradually gathering closer. Louis turned toward the center of the marketplace and ascended the platform where community announcements were usually made. "Citizens of St. Logan," he called out, his voice cutting through the murmurs until silence fell over the crowd. "I presented myself to you as Luc Morel. It was not a lie born of disdain or deceit, but a necessity, for I came here seeking something I believed lost forever, and I found it." The silence was thick, all eyes fixed on him. "My true name is Louis de Balmont, King of France." A murmur erupted like thunder among the crowd. Some took a step back, others crossed themselves, while Madame Rousseau opened her mouth but found no words. Madame Rousseau opened her mouth but no words came out. Armand paled but remained silent. Louis continued, his voice steady and unwavering. 11 years ago, I was betrayed by those who were supposed to protect me. They told me my son had died, but the truth was different. He was abandoned, hidden, and taken from me by decisions made behind my back. I didn't know where to look until I came here." He turned toward Elodie and Leon, his gaze softening as he looked at them. This woman, with no obligation other than her own kindness, took him in. She protected him, loved him, and gave him everything I couldn't. Thanks to her, I am whole again today. Leon looked up at his mother, seeking her eyes, and she gently stroked his hair without saying a word. Louis's voice rose, clear and resolute, echoing across the square. "I publicly recognize Leon as my legitimate son," he declared, "and I honor Elodie as the only woman to whom I owe more than life itself. She gave me the truth." A profound silence fell over the crowd once more, but this time it was different. It wasn't a silence of judgment, it was one of astonishment. From the edge of the square, a carriage came to a halt. 3 men dressed in black cloaks embroidered with the symbol of the fleur-de-lis stepped out. One of them approached with firm strides, holding a wooden box under his arm. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing low without regard for discretion, "we have been sent by order of the Royal Council to escort you back to Paris." Louis did not move. "I have made my decision," he replied. "I will not return under imposed conditions. I will not resolve this behind closed doors. I will not repeat the same mistakes twice." Another emissary interjected, his tone pleading. The scandal, Louis interrupted sharply, was leaving a child forgotten. It is time for honor to take precedence over convenience. My son will not be a secret, and this woman will be recognized for the place that rightfully belongs to her. I will face whatever comes if necessary, but I will not live among lies any longer. The uncomfortable emissary opened the wooden box and withdrew a sealed envelope. He extended it toward Louis. "It is a letter bearing the seal of the Queen Mother. She demands that the boy be brought to Paris immediately for a legitimacy evaluation." Louis took the envelope, holding it without opening it. For a moment he closed his eyes, knowing that this moment would mark the beginning of an even greater battle. The weight of the past and the ancient power seemed to vibrate through the wax seal imprinted with the Queen Mother's emblem. It was a gesture he knew all too well, an order disguised as protocol, an imposition cloaked in the appearance of justice. His fingers tightened around the edge of the paper, but he did not break it. For a brief moment he closed his eyes, searching within himself for the clarity needed to face the battle ahead. Elodie stood beside him, upright and composed, though she did not touch him. Yet her mere presence gave him strength. Leon, standing between them, looked at him with a mixture of awe and innocence. He didn't fully understand what it meant to be the king's son, but instinctively he knew something significant was about to be decided. "My answer is no," Luis finally said, his voice clear and unwavering. "I will not separate my son from his mother. I will not send him to be examined as if he were some dubious object. If Paris wants answers, they will hear them directly from my voice. We three will go together." The reactions were varied. Some villagers nodded silently, seeing him not as a king but as a man who had fought for his family. Armand and Madame Rousseau remained silent, defeated by the unyielding authority of a king who spoke as a father. The royal emissaries exchanged glances, and one of them nodded gravely. "Very well, Your Majesty, we will prepare the way." The journey to Paris was long but not bitter. With every step, Luis felt more resolute in his decision. He carried with him the evidence, the signet ring, the engraved medal, the testimony of the priest from St. Logan, and the written declaration of Adrienne de Marsac. The carriage moved along roads gilded by autumn leaves, and inside Elodie held Léon's hand, speaking softly to him about the trees they passed, the names of birds, and the properties of flowers that still resisted the changing season. They arrived at the palace at dawn. The iron gates creaked open with an ancient solemnity, and the royal council awaited them in a hall of white marble, crowned by domes and tall windows, through which light streamed as if the sun itself sought to illuminate the gathering. Luis refused to let anyone speak on his behalf. Before the ministers, doctors, historians, and the Queen Mother, he stood with the boy at his side and Elodie behind him like a silent anchor. With precision, he recounted every detail: the night of the scandal, the disappearance, the cover-up. He presented the physical evidence and testimonies, naming those responsible without hesitation. When he finished, a sepulchral silence filled the room. The Queen Mother, draped in a black velvet dress, her head held high as though she still sought to dominate with her gaze, took her time before speaking. Her eyes rested first on the boy, then on Elodie, and finally on her son. "Everything you say, Louis," she began slowly, "is plausible. And if the evidence holds, I will have no choice but to recognize the child. But there is a difference between an heir and a queen." Elodie clenched her jaw but did not lower her head. Luis did not wait. "The crown does not dictate whom I love," he responded with calm determination. "She is my choice, not only because she is the mother of my son, but because she is the only woman who has defied fear, poverty, prejudice, and loneliness to raise the child I should have protected." For a fleeting moment, the Queen Mother's implacability cracked. Perhaps it was the tone of his voice. Perhaps it was the expression on the boy's face as he clung to his father's hand. Or perhaps it was the truth itself imposing itself even in the halls where it had so often been denied. Finally, she spoke. Then so be it. The decree was sealed that same week, and Léon was officially recognized as the heir to the throne. Though the court murmured and the ministers debated in hushed tones, no one could contradict the sovereign who had faced the scandal with a dignity that surpassed even the palace walls. The ceremony was brief, discreet, yet brimming with emotion that not even the gilded architecture of the palace could contain. In that moment, standing together as a family, Luis, Elodie, and Léon became more than just figures in a royal drama. They became symbols of resilience, love, and the triumph of truth over deceit. Their story was far from over, but it had already begun to reshape the very foundation of the kingdom. Luis and Elodie exchanged their vows before a humble altar, surrounded only by a few trusted allies. Léon stood by them, holding the ring that had once connected their fates. Days later, they set out for St. Logan, not out of nostalgia, but gratitude. Luis wanted to close the chapter where it all began, allowing his son to bid farewell to the fields that had witnessed his growth, and ensuring the people there knew they would not be forgotten. One evening, bathed in the October dew, they strolled through the lavender fields. The vast sky stretched above them like a mantle of stars, shimmering with promises unspoken. Luis and Elodie walked hand in hand, their fingers intertwined, sharing a silence so comfortable it spoke louder than words ever could. "I never imagined this," Luis murmured softly, breaking the stillness. "Neither did I," Elodie replied, her voice steady yet gentle. "But life rarely asks us what we wish for." Luis drew her closer, his arm around her waist. She fit against him as though she had always belonged there. They paused by a low stone wall where clusters of lavender swayed gently in the night breeze. Elodie tilted her face toward him, a faint smile playing on her lips. Leaning close, she whispered into his ear, "There's something I haven't told you." Her words hung between them, light as a petal yet heavy with meaning. Luis looked at her, surprise flickering across his features. His heart raced with a mix of anticipation and hope. "I'm expecting a child," she said, her voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. The confession lingered in the air, delicate but profound. It stirred within Luis an overwhelming rush of emotion, leaving him breathless. He stood silently, gazing at her under the silver glow of the moon. Around them, the lavender fields stretched endlessly, an aromatic ocean bearing witness to this moment of pure joy. There was no greater happiness, no revelation more perfect. Elodie watched him, serene yet uncertain, her eyes bright with vulnerability, her lips slightly parted as if fearing he might not know how to respond. But Luis chose silence over words. Instead, he pulled her into his arms, holding her with a reverence that spoke volumes. In that embrace, under the open sky where their journey had begun, he realized the truth. The life he had long sought, the one that had slipped through his fingers time and again, was finally his. "Thank you," he whispered into her ear, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for teaching me what unconditional love truly means." That night, in the small house they had briefly called home, Luis slept with one hand resting protectively on Elodie's belly, as if shielding the new life growing within her. For the first time in years, sleep came to him without shadows or regrets. The following days were marked by farewells that healed old wounds. Upon returning to San Logan, changes began to take shape. Armand, once confident and imposing, was summoned by the king's emissaries and subjected to a formal investigation for defamation and abuse of influence. Under the weight of scandal, his demeanor crumbled. Stripped of his privileges, he was sent to a distant province to perform minor administrative duties, far from any position of power. His departure was quiet, unnoticed by the townsfolk who had once feared him. Madame Rousseau, whose rigid morality had fueled rumors and contributed to Elodie's isolation, was also called to account. Humiliated before the very community that had once revered her, she retreated from public life. Seeking solace in a nearby convent, she began participating in charitable works. Though she never explicitly apologized, her actions moving forward hinted at a silent repentance. Genevieve, Elodie's unwavering friend, was invited to join them in their new life. Sitting together on the porch at sunset, surrounded by baskets of flowers and cups of mint tea, Elodie extended an invitation. "Come with me," she said. "Not just as my friend, but as my companion in this new chapter. I can't imagine being in court without someone to remind me of who I am." Genevieve, accustomed to the simplicity of village life, hesitated at first, but seeing the sincerity in Elodie's eyes, she smiled and nodded. "If you go, I go." The news brought joy to the villagers, who had initially been cautious and even critical, but now viewed the unfolding story with pride. St. Logan would no longer be remembered merely for its lavender fields. It would forever be known as the place where a king found his son, where a woman changed the course of a dynasty, and where love triumphed over judgment. Even the parish priest, whose initial hesitation had contributed to Elodie's isolation, sought an audience with Luis and his family. Beneath the arches of the church, during a modest service devoid of pomp, he blessed the royal family with heartfelt words. "There is no greater miracle than the transformation of a heart," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "You have brought light to this town, and I ask forgiveness for failing to see it sooner." When the ceremony ended, Luis embraced the priest, sealing a new bond rooted in humility and forgiveness. With their return to the palace, Luis carried with her lessons learned in the countryside. Guided by Elodie's clear-eyed perspective, he initiated reforms that broke centuries of tradition. For the first time, rural communities were invited to send representatives to court audiences. Agricultural councils were formed, networks promoting botanical education and natural medicine were established, and decisions were no longer made solely within gilded halls, but also in harmony with the land itself. Elodie, though reluctant at first, found her place in this evolving order. She remained true to herself, walking the marble corridors in simple dresses, her hands still carrying the scent of rosemary and earth. When she spoke, everyone listened, not because she sought power, but because her voice resonated with purpose. In a court accustomed to whispers of ambition, her authenticity sparked a quiet revolution. Léon, the prince heir, grew up among books and gardens, dividing his days between history lessons and playful afternoons outdoors. He was curious, agile, and full of questions, embodying both the discipline of a future monarch and the freedom of a child raised amidst the scents of lavender and stories whispered by his mother. The court, initially wary, came to admire and even adore this woman who never sought to please anyone but her conscience. Even the Queen Mother, once unyielding, softened when Léon ran to her one day, holding a flower in his hand and calling her grandmother. Something inside her shifted then. From that moment on, her relationship with Elodie evolved. They weren't intimate, but they shared silences without discomfort and spoke without hidden meanings. One clear afternoon, sunlight filtering through the rose garden like golden honey, the family took a walk together. Louise held Elodie's hand naturally, as if love required no permission. She wore a blue linen dress, her hair loosely braided, and rested one hand lightly on her rounded belly. "He moves a lot," she said softly, smiling. "It's as if he already wants to run after his brother." Louise chuckled, stopping to kiss her temple. "He'll have someone to follow, though I fear I'll end up protecting them both as if they were made of glass." "They're not made of glass, Louise," she replied gently. "They're made of us." Nearby, Léon darted between the rose bushes, laughing, his golden curls dancing in the wind. The scene was so perfect it felt like a dream, but it wasn't. It was the reward for everything they had endured, resisted, and felt deeply without needing to say a word. Louise gazed at the horizon, where the sky merged with the earth in a golden line painted by the setting sun. "Everything that comes next," he said to Elodie, "is for you, for us. Not because of a crown or lineage, but because we deserve it." She looked at him with tenderness, and in that moment, he knew there could be no greater promise or truer one. As the sun dipped behind the distant vineyards, a soft breeze carried with it a familiar scent. Lavender, not from the palace gardens, but from the fields they had left behind. It was as if the earth itself remembered, and in that fleeting instant, suspended between past and present, the circle of their story closed. What destiny had planted among roots and shadows, love had made eternal in the light of day. Thank you for listening to this story until the end. We hope it moved you as much as it did us while crafting it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Where are you tuning in from, and what part of the story touched you most? If you enjoyed this tale, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave a like. Your support motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories filled with emotion and insight. And before we say goodbye, don't miss the recommendation for another captivating story appearing on your screen. Click the video to enjoy it. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in our next story.